Welcome to this explainer. When we picture the 19th century American frontier, our minds almost automatically go straight to that classic, heavily mythologized male archetype, right? The solitary trapper, the gritty miner, or the rugged cowboy. But honestly, that completely masks the actual lived reality of Western expansion. Today, we're going to look past those Hollywood stereotypes to uncover the hidden architectural force of the West. Because the permanent settlement of this incredibly unforgiving landscape, it wasn't just a story of men claiming land. It was an absolute grueling battle for survival, sanity, and civilization, fought every single day by pioneer women.
Let's dive right into the massive cultural friction these women had to endure. Think about it. They were raised on what was known as the cult of true womanhood. These were incredibly rigid Victorian ideals that basically dictated women had to be delicate, pure, and strictly confined to this refined indoor domestic sphere. But how in the world does that fragile ideal survive when it literally crashes face first into the raw dirt of the frontier? Out on those overland trails, these exact same women were suddenly forced to drive heavy wagons, chop wood, and reset broken bones. This violent collision between who society told them to be and what they absolutely had to do just to survive really formed the psychological core of the female frontier experience. Here's the thing we often forget. A lone guy extracting resources from the earth doesn't actually build a civilization. It was the relentless and largely invisible physical labor of women that actually transformed temporary muddy camps into permanent human settlements. By establishing agricultural rhythms and building social institutions completely from scratch, they turned these unforgiving landscapes into functioning households. They literally anchored the geopolitical expansion of an entire nation.
And the sheer volume of this civilizational anchor, it was staggering. Long before the sun even thought about coming up, typically right around 4 a.m., the pioneer woman was already at work, in the pitch dark. Remember, there's no dialing up the thermostat here, no flipping a switch or turning on a faucet. This pre-dawn start wasn't some plucky, proactive choice. It was a mandatory daily defense mechanism just to keep the homestead from completely collapsing into chaos before the day even truly began.
Imagine the visceral reality of this daily grind for a second. We're talking about an environment of intense manual labor, compounded by constant physical danger. Picture the acrid, eye-watering smoke of boiling lye and animal fat over an open fire, which you had to do just to make some crude soap. Or feel the sheer exhaustion of hauling incredibly heavy wooden buckets of creek water for miles. And then imagine the absolute terror of fending off highly venomous rattlesnakes while you're literally just trying to sweep your floor. This wasn't just housework, folks. This was a daily, brutal battle against the elements.
To really immerse ourselves in this, step inside a sadi with me, a house carved right out of prairie dirt and grass roots. The reality of living in one of these was pretty grim. Dirt and insects were constantly falling right from the ceiling into your food and your hair. Since timber was incredibly scarce, the cramped air just choked you with the thick smoke of burning buffalo dung, which was their main source of fuel. Oh, and those rattlesnakes we mentioned, they actually burrowed directly through the dirt walls. Pioneer women very often slept with a heavy hoe right next to the bed, just a totally necessary weapon to kill vipers that decided to intrude in the middle of the night.
Now, what's really interesting, and frankly terrifying, is how these extreme physical hazards were so profoundly compounded by human biology. In an era where birth control basically didn't exist, these women lived in a continuous, exhausting cycle of pregnancy and lactation, all while doing that back-breaking manual labor. Bearing 10 to 15 children was incredibly common. And since childbirth was actually the leading cause of death among women at the time, this silent, intense anxiety hung over every single household.
The stakes were probably never higher than out on the overland trails. These wagon trains were governed by rigid, unforgiving schedules, constantly racing against the winter snows. Because of that, mothers rarely got more than a single day's rest after giving birth. There's this one diary from a woman named Elizabeth, and she records the absolute agony of being forced back onto the trail right after childbirth. She writes about wading through knee-deep, freezing mud with her newborn in her arms, her feet totally numb with cold, all while her husband lay dying of an illness in their wagon. Her ultimate survival is just a staggering testament to human endurance.
So, how did they survive medically? Well, in the total absence of professional doctors, frontier healthcare essentially splintered into two desperate directions. On one hand, you had informal midwifery.
This meant relying on botanical brews like wasp nest tea, or even sympathetic magic, like literally placing a sharp metal axe under a birthing bed to symbolically cut the pain. On the other hand, you had unregulated patent medicines. Traveling hucksters would sell these commercial tonics, marketed specifically to cure so-called female complaints. The catch? They were heavily laced with ethanol, opium, and cocaine, leading to widespread, unrecognized substance dependency among isolated women who were desperately trying to numb chronic pain.
The true lifeline of the frontier, though, was absolutely the network of women helping women. Local midwives were the indispensable pillars of these communities. Women like Sarah McKee Davis, who possessed this highly specialized botanical and anatomical knowledge, would travel across massive territories at all hours of the day and night. They'd navigate deadly blizzards and brutal terrain in crude wagons just to deliver babies and set bones. This incredibly fragile web of female cooperation was very often the only safety net these families possessed.
But physical danger and disease were matched by an equally lethal psychological environment. For families moving from bustling European cities or the heavily forested East, the Great Plains offered a profound, terrifying spatial disorientation. Think about it. The landscape was just a vast, flat ocean of grass stretching to the horizon, completely unbroken by trees or geographic landmarks. Combined with massive social isolation, this extreme sensory deprivation triggered what was called prairie madness, a devastating mental health crisis characterized by severe clinical depression, shifting personalities, and sometimes utter psychological collapse.
And this psychological burden fell wildly disproportionately on women, which reveals a really deep gendered contradiction in the frontier experience. Men generally had an outlet, right? Their work required regular travel into town to buy supplies, negotiate trades, and socialize. Women, on the other hand, were largely marooned on the homestead. Immobilized in that boundless ocean of grass and bound to this endless, repetitive cycle of isolated domestic labor, a woman could easily go months, literally months, without seeing another adult outside her immediate family.
You can clearly hear the profound psychological anxiety this isolation bred in the journals of women like Anna Rupenthal. After a relentlessly exhausting day of physical labor, her final nightly routine didn't offer any peace. Instead, while her family slept, she would stand outside in the dark, anxiously scanning the vast horizon for the glow of deadly prairie fires. These women essentially lived in a state of continuous hypervigilance, bearing the emotional weight of their entire family's survival completely alone.
To stave off that crushing silence and preserve their sanity inside those dark, dirt-walled homes, women sought out some pretty desperate creative comforts. Believe it or not, many pioneer women kept a small, brightly colored bird in a cage. Because it required very little food, it offered this tiny, vital splash of vibrancy and a cheerful song. It was just a beautiful, incredibly fragile attempt to secure some kind of daytime companionship and distraction from that immense, quiet void of the prairie waiting just outside their door. Yet, arguably their most powerful tool for survival wasn't a pet or an object, it was the act of writing itself. When all normal societal bombs are totally stripped away, keeping a diary or writing letters stops being a leisurely hobby. It becomes a crucial, private, textual refuge. The blank page was a literal mechanism for cognitive preservation, a sacred space to process unspeakable traumas, like the tragic loss of a child when no one else was around. Writing allowed them to construct some sense of narrative order out of the wilderness chaos and hold fiercely onto their own identities.
And those diaries reveal just how deeply ingrained their social expectations remained, even at the absolute edge of the known world. Mary Richardson Walker's journal captures this astounding collision between Victorian ideals and raw biology perfectly. Even in the agonizing advanced stages of labor, the strict social codes of household order compelled her to push through the pain just to bake bread, cook dinner, and organize her clothes. She literally demanded her house be in perfect order before she granted herself permission to give birth. I mean, wow.
Reading through these pages, we also witness a profound existential terror. Molly Dorsey Sanford documented this constant gnawing anxiety she termed retrogression. She was absolutely terrified that the endless degrading work of picking potato bugs and just surviving in a mud-filled floorless cabin would eventually strip away her intellect, her education, and her Eastern refinement. It was a daily psychological war, not just against the harsh elements, but against losing her very humanity to the dirt.
As we wrap up this explainer, looking back at the staggering resilience, that invisible labor, and the immense psychological endurance of these women, we're really left to weigh their ultimate legacy. Did stepping out of the traditional parlor and surviving the brutal, demanding American West ultimately liberate these women? Or by successfully shouldering the impossible burden of maintaining civilized households out in the wilderness, did they permanently cement the punishing expectations of intensive domestic labor as a defining pillar of American life? It's a profound contradiction, and one that fundamentally rewrites our entire understanding of the frontier.